All right, so Matthew, go ahead.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, Kathy, and everybody for the invitation and for your patience as we get things set up here today. And there's nothing like we were chatting beforehand, is some days the gremlins show up in the technology infrastructure, and this seems to be one of those days. It's my pleasure to be here. I really appreciate everybody choosing to spend some time with me today during National Accessibility Week here in Canada. This is also, it's very heartwarming to know that accessibility is a priority amongst the veterinary community, and all the more so because in my travels, everybody that I connect with across industries and sectors has a ton on their plate. And so, what we're trying to do is juggle all of our competing priorities and deliverables. I am always heartwarmed to see accessibility coming into the discussion and to see more and more sectors and industries recognizing the contribution that it can make to your work. So, I thank you for being here today, and I intend to do my best to make valuable use of the time that you're sharing with me. So let's just, I'm just going to double check a couple of things here, make sure things are moving through okay. Great. So I am here today on behalf of the Rick Hansen Foundation. And this is actually a very special time in the organization's history because as we speak, we are entering into the 40th anniversary of the original Man in Motion World Tour. And if you're not familiar, in 1985, after sustaining a spinal cord injury as a young man and becoming a very decorated Paralympian, Rick decided to raise awareness for people with disabilities by rolling more than 40,000 kilometers around the world and touching 34 countries over 2 years. And our organization was formed as an offshoot of that initial Man in Motion World Tour with the specific goal of inspiring and creating and delivering solutions and changing systems that enable people with disabilities to participate in every aspect of life in our country and to try to mobilize and bring together industries, sectors, and governments in this work. And one of the areas that we really identified as an area for us to work in was related to the built environment. The system that produces the built world around us is one of the most complex systems in the world, and I describe it as a system in which inaccessibility is nobody's goal, but it's a huge output of the system. And so, in this, when we rely on built infrastructure for so much of our daily life, we committed as an organization to playing our role in shaping the built environment system, the world of developers, municipalities, building codes, and ordinary folks and industries working within our broader sector to try to tilt the system that produces those places and spaces that we live our lives in to making sure that these spaces are usable and accessible to absolutely everyone. So, one of our major interventions that I'll allude to today, it won't be the focus, the sole focus of our conversation, is we built a building certification program that is essentially the first one in the world that looks at how buildings perform for the people who are moving through them and using them. And in particular, looking at that through the lens of users with disabilities. If we design and we look at our spaces through the lenses of trying to ensure that they support the diverse functioning of humans, then we are better prepared to ensure that our spaces are working for the needs of everyone who engages with them, whether they're employees, whether they're customers, whether they're visitors, and so on. So we built a building certification program. It works in a very similar way to other types of building certification programs that are related to energy conservation or affordability in construction. But it's a way of getting a big picture view of how accessible is our space, how is someone likely to experience it. And this isn't just us, it is a combination of working with industry and government and technical standards and all of these things to bring this method together. And I'll say a little bit more about this as we go a little bit deeper into the program, but just to outline things. for now. That's our core area and one of our core areas of focus as a foundation. So my name is Matthew. I describe what I do as an accessibility practice. And what we're looking at when we're doing the accessibility practice is we're looking at just the different ways in which our bodies work and move through the world, and using this perspective to remove barriers, to increase participation as a human rights point of view, but also as a way to just doing business better, creating economic value, social value, and engaging the talents of everybody in our shared endeavor. And my entry point into this work goes back more than a decade and a half ago, but just to really focus and get an entry point into this is that this is not actually a professional mission for me so much as it is a personal one. And I like to show off my family, a picture from a few years ago. My life does not ever look like this. This is totally manufactured and staged. But I do love to show them off whenever I have an opportunity. And shortly after my son was born, I received a very startling diagnosis. Now, disability had been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. I was born severely hard of hearing. One of my earliest memories is of my mother trying to hold me long enough to get this ugly hearing aid thing into my ear. And so for all my childhood, I knew I was very different in the sense that there were things about me that were different from everybody else around me. When I was in university, my mother had a brain aneurysm, which she was fortunate to survive, but changed everything about my family's way of life, from where we lived to how we moved through the world, an introduction into the labyrinthian world of rehab and care and all of those other spin-offs. But it wasn't until I was diagnosed with the blinding eye disease 6 months after my son was born that I really had an enormous aha moment in the way that the disability experience shaped and guided so much of what I did in my everyday life. So I like to show this image here. It's from the National Eye Research Institute in the United Kingdom, one of the leading research facilities for eye diseases in the world. It's the best example I can find of what the world looks like for me today. I've lost approximately 93% of my eyesight, which had very slowly eroded over a long time. And then after that diagnosis, promptly fell off a cliff. And so when that happens, everything about moving through the world around me suddenly started to change. And all of those things I took for granted were now really being brought to the fore. And it's a very disorienting experience to all of a sudden be moving through these built spaces in these different ways, all of these like tricks it was playing on me, and all of the new solutions and ways of thinking about being in that space that I had to do. I wanted to engage with everything exactly the same as before. But all of a sudden, I was realizing that it was going to take a whole new set of strategies to be successful in that environment. And there are two really big insights I'd like to share with you as we kind of set the stage and dive into this. The first is I became acutely aware of how much the experience of disability is a market force, this kind of energy that's guiding so much human decision making around the world, and how bad we actually are at recognizing that. Um, for my family, after my mother's aneurysm, for example, a decision about where to eat on a Friday evening was going to take into account factors such as where can we get in and how are we going to move through, and ways that like we just all do these things, right? We all have connections with people with disabilities. Maybe we're looking after an older parent, or maybe we have a child who has a disability. We kind of see it everywhere around us, and we're making decisions about it all the time, but we don't always see it. The single biggest principle, the second, that I want to share with you is something I have taken to calling the ability error. And it goes something like this. At the end of the day, everything we do is mediated through our bodies and our minds. There's nothing we do that doesn't come to us through our physical body or our way of perceiving and processing the world. Seems obvious enough, but the corollary to that problem is so much of what we make in this world ignores this essential fact. So if you start seeing the world through this way, everything from how we design clothing, to how we design customer service hotlines, to how we make buildings, to how we make spaces, to how we communicate with people in customer service settings, to how we design phone applications, to how we design vehicles. You'll see some areas are better than others, but you'll see that so much of what we design is built around a misconception of or an average of what human performance looks like. And the result of that is that so many of the things that we build and make are actually not usable and accessible to a wide portion of our population. And the thing that's challenging about that is disability is one of the biggest forces in the world. So, roughly a quarter of people worldwide and in Canada identify as having a disability that limits their daily activities. And you'll find this replicated in almost any jurisdiction and almost any environment. So, up to 25% of the population. And that's a huge number, but even that's slightly misleading because, for the example that I shared earlier, which is that so many of the decisions we make are not always made because we're in a unit of one, right? We're parts of families, we're parts of communities, we're parts of groups. We have research that suggests that disability directly touches the lives of almost 50% of Canadians vis-a-vis who they identify as their immediate family network. And so then those decisions like where my family is going to eat dinner on a Friday night is a decision being made because of one experience of disability, but a group, in my case, of of as many as 10 of us at any one point in time. And there are many kinds and experiences of disability. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that today. What's really important to know as we dive into this topic is that the experience of disability is really unique because it expresses itself almost everywhere. It is not contingent on sex, gender, economic status, geography. It will transcend any cultural barrier, uh, any any description by which we often use to think of or confer a sense of identity. One of my favorite party trick games is to challenge people to say, find me a space in which I'm not going to find an expression of disability. And we can usually look into it and find it everywhere. It can happen to us at any time. We can inherit it from birth or acquire it later. As we get older, we all converge toward it. And if we're blessed to live long enough, we will see our human functionality deteriorate and change as we get older. And so one of the things that can really be hard to wrap your head around is like, how do I begin to think about this, or how do I begin to put borders on how I think about accessibility and disability? So just for a couple of things that'll be relevant to our journey here is that if we have an experience in our family or in our community, we become really good at seeing for that experience. But then we might miss many kinds of others. Um, so broadly speaking, just to establish a bit of a baseline, on the screen in front of you are the categories that are used in our federal disability reporting here in Canada, which groups disabilities into categories related to seeing, hearing, a variety of mobility related experiences. So mobility is in moving around, flexibility, dexterity, pain, learning, developmental or cognitive. This would also include the large family of neurodiverse experiences, sensory processing disabilities, autism, and so on, mental health, and memory. I actually don't really like this categorization. I think it's kind of strange and arbitrary and isn't quite reflective of they're not the best signposts that I would use, but it's what we use for data collection here in Canada, and they do kind of give you an umbrella to begin to think about all of these different experiences that are contained within within this large disability umbrella. And there are others as well. This isn't exclusive. But what's really kind of interesting is as we get older and we find ourselves converging towards these in one way, shape, or form, and those kinds of patterns of expression are changing and they're popping up everywhere and they're kind of taking different shapes. And getting ready for this presentation, I wanted to investigate how is disability likely to be expressed in the veterinary community. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was I saw a few pieces of research from institutions such as yours and the Institute on Animal Health that suggested that seniors are more likely to be pet owners relative to the other demographic ranges in Canada. So so we're more likely in veterinary environments. I also want to take a moment just to recognize too that for folks on this call, that practice is happening in a lot of different domains and settings. Some of it might be urban, some of it might be rural, some of it might be fixed office locations, some might be more travel, and they'll all look very different. And that's cool. But we begin to see some of these common threads and these kind of common audiences and so on. So what's really important that I just want to hammer for today is to think about disability as something that is a phenomenon that arises when the individual and the environment are out of sync. And I could do a whole graduate level course on this sentence. It would take a long time to unpack it. But fundamentally, what we're doing is we're looking at the fact that it's the world around us that shapes the experience of disability. It is not the performance of a single person. An example of that I would use is I can't see or hear very well. If I'm in the kitchen at home, it's very easy for my kids to tug on my coat and get daddy's attention. Let's pretend I'm now trying to buy tickets to go to the Toronto Blue Jays game downtown. There are thousands of people milling around. I'm trying to talk to the customer service attendant who's on the other side of 3 inches of plexiglass. I have to do my best to see their lips so that I can read their lips because I can't hear very well. I also can't let my kids out of my sight and I have to hold on to them. What's happening is the environment is amplifying and accelerating the disabling experience. And so when we bring it into our practice here is to say, and where in our veterinary environments, whether we're talking about our employees, whether we're talking about the patients and the patients' families, like what are some of the things, how are our environment shaping and driving that experience? Are there parts of our space that we think are amplifying that experience of disability? And are there parts that are minimizing that experience? And then how do we proceed from there? So now what we'll do is we'll dive into a little bit deeper into some kind of core concepts, and then I'll go show you some examples of built environment features that are relevant to different types of veterinary offices, and then we can kind of go and address any specific questions if we have time at the end of the presentation, or to take some questions or meet up with people independently and come back and share this information at a deeper time. So what we're really doing when we get into this space is we're practicing how we like airdrop into any environment and how we kind of turn and look around that environment and try to look at how are the features and attributes of this environment working together to produce an experience for an end user. And what's that? How do we get better at identifying where those features are creating barriers? And that's the essential activity. I get asked a lot of technical questions in my travels around how wide does this need to be? What needs to be done with this? The fundamental principle is we have technical details and specs. But before we even get down to that level, the honest truth is we just have to practice flexing the muscle. I do this every day. If I stop for a couple of weeks, I need that to stretch that muscle again before I kind of come back to it and get into the work because it is an empathy and a projection exercise. And the only way to really get comfortable with it is to practice doing it. And that's something that any of us can do, whether we're professional or whether we're lay people in this regard. The most important principle that if I conveyed nothing else to you today that I would want you to remember, it would be that we have to look at accessibility through the lens of purpose. Why is the space here? What are we doing and offering and providing as veterinary professionals? Like, what business are we in and what do we want our employees, patients, and families and the community, what do we want them to do while they're here? It's just a single missing piece if your approach to accessibility starts with building codes, technical specs, and so on. And I'll get to that in a minute. But the single most important thing you can do is say, why is all of this here? And then we get to look through the lens of how do I make sure that everybody who comes here for this purpose is able to participate in that experience in the same way and have their autonomy and their choice and their flexibility. So the way I like to illustrate this principle is I show an image of an amusement park because everybody kind of gets what these amusement parks are all about. They're designed to be total sensory experiences. Every sound, every action, every movement is designed to work together in tandem to fully engage you and to separate you from the money in your wallet, but also to produce a kind of experience. And if it's a theme park and we're trying to produce an experience for children, it looks something kind of like this. And this is how we know that we're being successful, is that all of those parts are working together to produce that effect for the common purpose. We do the same thing when we talk about accessibility in our environments. And so when we're kind of looking around our offices and our spaces, we want to look at how all of those features are working together to produce that common experience. And in order to do that, everything in the space is working together. There's a total journey. We have to arrive, we have to move, we have to find the front entrance, we have to move through. There is very often a reception area, a concierge point where we administer all of our services. We have the spaces as we move through a building. This includes not only the obvious, like where do our patients and customers go, but also where do our employees go. Very easy to ignore the fact that this expression of disability will present itself in our own employees and our teams and our workforces as well. And so, how do we make sure that we are covering those areas as well? Washrooms, emergency systems is a huge one. How do we get out in the event of emergency? How do we make sure that our built environment or that our policies and procedures include that accessibility perspective and that point of view? And they all work together. I sometimes use an analogy of a vehicle. Like if we've all got into the car and went to work this morning, if I asked you what a car was, you'd probably give me a description or a definition about four wheels and a steering wheel, etc. But in terms of how we experience it, a car is actually like a magic teleportation device, right? We get in the car in the morning, we have our coffee, we start thinking about what we have to do at the office when we get there, the first patient, maybe we've got the radio on, and you magically appear at the office, right? But there's actually 30,000 parts in that car. And all it takes is for one of them to really fall out so that the check engine light comes on. There's a really funny rattle. You can forget about the podcast. You can forget about thinking about everything else you're all doing. All of a sudden, you're just kind of plopped in the middle of an incontrovertible moment. And that experience of access can fall out of a building really quick. I can't tell you the number of times a building has had, very accessible ways to get in, to move around, very thoughtful design and consideration. Maybe we get to the washroom that's intended to be the accessible washroom, and there is not enough space for someone using a wheel mobility device to transfer from their wheelchair to the toilet. The experience, the bottom of that experience has suddenly fallen out, and it's literally the worst possible time, right, for that experience to happen. And so we have to look at all of those things together. And one of my favorite things to do is to walk around spaces with folks and we pick out features and we talk about what they look like from different points of view of disability experience. And I'd love to spend more time on here, but I'll probably go pretty quickly for the sake of today. Um, Exterior approach and entrance. We love glazed surfaces. We love minimalist entrance, nice clean looks, right? For someone like me, it can be a real challenge to find where the entrance to one of these buildings is. Or if you have very limited mobility, maybe you can only walk 100 meters at a time without sitting down. And let's pretend that this building that's in this large facade that's in this picture on the screen here, let's pretend it was a commercial office in which you might find, in which one of a vet practice might be located, is is that you might think the entrance is on one side of the building. You use up your 100 meters of walking time, realize you're nowhere near an entrance. And now you have nowhere to sit down. You have nowhere to rest. You're not near anywhere and you're kind of stuck. Or in my case, I would be looking to this building for all of the cues, like what is there something that suggests that there's an entrance? In this case, this building here has an overhanging shelter structure that really suggests where the main entrance is going to be. We get to things like paths of travel. Are they even and are they graded? Are they sloped? Is there edge protection? This pathway on the bottom here has a curb edge protection, which for someone like me, I use a white cane. If I was walking down this path, which is not perfectly straight, the white cane would at least indicate and provide a hedge against myself kind of rolling down the side of the hill, or would prevent a wheelchair from sliding out of control and going down the hill. If we get inside and we get into those traditional reception and service areas, such as the front desk of a clinic, is are they easy to find? Do we know where they are? Do they contrast with the surrounding surfaces? Are there actually multiple heights or levels? So for someone using a wheelchair or in a seated position to be able to roll up to the counter and have a conversation, is there clear space underneath so that we can pull up? One thing that's very, very common is there's a service counter on the screen here with a recessed area underneath. These types of recesses accumulate boxes like nobody's business, right? Both on the customer side of the desk and on the employee side. And they become these temporary but permanent barriers to pulling up. Another example that's very common is we might have multiple heights of counters, but the payment terminal is located on a side of the desk that cannot be reached or used from the accessible height. Another example would be things like, do we have other kinds of assistive listening and technology and communication supports to be able to assist with people who might be hard of hearing? Very common, I would imagine, in a lot of vet environments where a lot of the patients might be seniors. What are those other factors that are occurring in the environment around us that might produce noise that interfere with the experience of getting service at a desk? Doors and doorways is another common one, how we open them and move through them. Do we have power operated door openers to the main areas of our clinic? What does it look like? Are they in the kinds of right places? Are they little and small, which can be really hard for some users to access, or are they elongated so that you can open them? Your service animal can lean on them, or you can hit them with your foot, or nudge them with a chair, so on. Is it easy to know where the doors and the frames are? Signage is a big one, and directional indication if we're in larger sites. For someone like me, where signs are placed, the more predictable the signage placement is, the easier it is for someone who's low vision to find it. If you read raised letters or braille, you want all the signs to be posted on the latch side of the door, not the hinge side of the door. If it's a hinge side of the door, I lean in and kind of just to get a closer look at the letters or to touch the raised letters and risk popping my head like a walnut if the door opens because the sign's on the hinge side and I'm right in the middle. It's just like a walnut, like a nutcracker. Washrooms are a really big one, and the ability to provide an accessible and universal washroom is a huge game breaker. So often, people with disabilities or people will ask me, Matt, what's one thing we could do that would like transform the experience of accessibility? And I say, well, you're not going to like it. It's not the most sexy answer ever, but if every washroom, if we knew when we went into an accessible washroom exactly what we were going to get, that would be a game changer. And in washrooms, we get into like the details really matter. Like a common example in this case, there's a good picture of a universal washroom stall here. Just to pick one example out of a dozen, is that in this case, it's an open face toilet paper roll. That is good. You know, these kind of the ones with the closed fronts that we have to pull underneath take a lot of pinching, really hard to operate, also really clunky, take up too much space to properly maneuver in this washroom. One of the things that often happens is that toilet paper roll in the photo will be way too far out from the toilet, which means you can't reach it unless you lean forward or bend over. But there's a huge number of people who have mobility and flexibility issues. They don't have the ability to bend over, or they don't have the ability to maintain their equilibrium and to bend and to take advantage and to use it properly. So we're getting into like the game of millimeters and inches when we're looking at how well do our universal washrooms meet the needs of the people who use them. When we get into emergency exits, we're looking at areas of refuge. How do we actually exit buildings? Do we have a spot for people to go if our clinic is not on a ground floor or an accessible ground exit? How do our emergency procedures consider the needs of people with disabilities? Do we have areas for them to go? What does that look like? How do we make sure these processes are being inclusive? And then the last one I'll think of, I'll just identify here are mind-friendly environments. So how are our environments experienced if we have a different way of processing the world around us? If we have sensory processing disabilities or experiences like autism, we can be triggered by loud sounds, loud or unexpected noises, scents, um, many different ways to experience disequilibrium. And so, how do our environments, do we provide an area on site that is a designated quiet area? Or do we have a room that's specifically for employees or guests who need some quiet time or who need some privacy? Obviously, we'll see this in clinics and many different expressions and experiences already, but and that's wonderful because where these things exist, they can serve this other purpose. Just, when we have families who are in distress, um, because their beloved animal is having a crisis, and what do we have available to that, and how do we kind of provide for those kinds of opportunities? So I mentioned earlier the importance of purpose in all of this. And the single biggest question I get all the time is this is all covered in the building code, and presumably my building has passed the building code, so I presume everything that's in my space is going to create the user experience that is necessary. But you can just see from what I've already shared with you what some of the limitations of that might be. First of all, the age of the building and the space is going to determine what building code applied when, and it's going to be extremely out of date. And the second is that building codes don't, in a meaningful way, are not that interested in actually what your site is for. and what your purpose is. And one of my jokes is there's very little difference between a federal prison and a theme park from a structural point of view. Both the prison and the theme park have a multitude of buildings. The occupancies might be the same. There's a lot of highly restricted areas, the same types of plumbing and structural requirements. Yet the purpose and the experience within those could not be more diametrically opposed, right? And so the single biggest thing really is we don't take any of our cues. If we're looking to build a successful business or practice, we never look to the minimum requirements of whatever the regulatory environment we're operating within is. We want to meet those minimum requirements and exceed them, but we're also trying to differentiate and to provide a particular kind of service and to a particular kind of experience. So that's going to bring me kind of into like the nitty gritty of, so what do we all do? We're here on this call. We're interested in this space. We have practices. How do we begin to look at this and what can we do? So I mentioned at the start that we have an accessibility certification program. It is an opportunity for organizations to have a standardized evaluation of a site completed to help identify short and long-term identify overall performance as well as short and long-term opportunities to grow and improve. And we have rated more than 2,000 sites across the country, and we're working deeply in a number of different industries to try to raise the floor and help provide the tools and strategies for organizations to enhance their spaces. And I'm delighted to be on this call today because some examples of areas where I'm spending more and more time is in the healthcare sector writ large in terms of hospitals and other types of care settings. I'm also seeing a real shift in interest in accessibility and highly specialized lab environments. And so that there are many labs and educational institutions across the country that are really beginning to look into how do we make sure that these spaces where we might not think of as public spaces, how do we ensure that they're improving and meeting on accessibility? So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide here, but this is just positioning our certification for users against the many other certifications that exist when we're looking at building performance. And one of the great ironies is that we know how buildings perform for carbon, for energy conservation, for sustainability, for affordable construction. We know more about building performance for all of those areas than we do about how they perform for people. And that's one of the areas that we wanted to specifically rectify. Um, in order to evaluate whether you're doing it professionally through our certification or whether you're going to get off this call, go back to your office and say, I want to walk around and practice flexing the muscle. The way you're going to do that is you're kind of going to go through that whole process, right? You're going to start with how you get to the site. You're going to follow the experience of an employee through the clinic and of a visitor to the clinic. And we're going to practice flexing our muscle to look at all of these core areas from how we get there to how do we get in, how do we move through it, how do we serve people at the front desk, what do we need to do in each of the main and support areas of our site. If we're a bigger site and we have signage, what does it look like? Emergency systems, how we use technology, mind-friendly considerations, and so on. If this is of interest to you and you have further questions, we do offer at the foundation a number of opportunities you might be interested in. We have an accessibility professional network, which is a very low cost and easy way to tie into ongoing trends in the accessibility environment and to connect you with a community of people that are in a similar space. We do also offer a number of training courses of different degrees of intensity on fundamental accessibility and inclusion awareness, key principles that you might be interested in. We have a deeper dive course that looks at some of what we've talked about today in terms of how do built environments produce an experience of meaningful access and barriers, or we also have our deepest level of training, which is for people who would like to be able to actually administer and conduct and submit ratings using our system. That's not required. You don't have to get this designation, have your own site be professionally evaluated by somebody who is trained in conducting these types of experiences, but it's an option. We do have some upcoming training courses. Our professional training offering there's going to be one that starts in the fall of 2025. And if anybody is interested, I'm happy to spend more time at another point in going over some of those. So if we look at RHFAC ratings and why we should consider doing them, opportunity for people first performance and baselines, and really helping people understand how do I make the right, like what should I be doing now? What can I do that's cheap and easy or free? What are the things that are going to move the needle for my space? Um, and what's the pathway to help me get to where I want to go? Um, and so that's where I'll maybe stop and I'll open it up for any questions from the audience. And I'll put my information up on the screen. I can be reached at mshaw@rickhansen with an e.com. And I'm always happy to connect with individuals or help point you in the right direction. Or if there are questions that perhaps you don't want to answer or ask on a group call, but you'd like to get some more information on. And so I think with there, I'll just turn it back over to the team and say thank you very much for the opportunity to be with all of you today. I hope you found this a helpful dive into the disability experience, what it means to have meaningful access as our North Star, and then to begin to look at what are some of the features in our environment that contribute to that, and how can we begin to look into this and bring this kind of approach and work back to our practice. So, with that, it's the last day of National Accessibility Week here in Canada. So, I wish all of you a happy National Accessibility Week, and thank you once again for spending time with me. And I'll turn it back over to the group.
Thank you, Matthew. Just a quick audio check. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Awesome. So grateful for that. I'm really happy that I was able to get my audio organized so that I could hear the amazing information you provided. Um, Thank you so much, Matthew. I go back to something you mentioned, which was, I think, the mindful environment. And we know that veterinary clinics are very noisy environments. There can be a lot of metal, for instance, in the mixed animal practices, in the chutes or areas that animals come into. It can also be noisy environments in a small animal practice. I know there are some folks on the line who are hard of hearing and also are deaf, and they do practice and they're veterinary professionals, likely wondering about how would they go about making a sound dampened room to even be able to hear better when they've got their stethoscope on and they're maybe listening to their, the lungs or the heart rate of an animal. So any suggestions or even links of resources that folks could go to?
No, that's a great question. So there's a lot of different approaches that one can take to this. I mean, one thing that's very common is, do we have opportunity to make separate or private multi-use spaces? So do we have anywhere where we can carve off a specific room or construct a room or whatever that can be then, and you can evaluate that use case against whether it's on the practice side or whether it's on the patient side. That's one opportunity. A second is trying to find, if you can't have a distinct space that you kind of use for some of these materials, you can look at having designated areas where it's like these are particular spots where we really try to minimize noise for one in one way or another. There are some different kinds of sound dampening strategies that we can use in terms of how we do insulation or sound baffling on the ceilings and the floor. One example of things that often happens, which we have to be mindful of when it comes to accessibility, is we can look at floor treatments and really low profile carpet and flooring that absorb sound better than a lot of lab spaces are often very clinical with a lot of hard surfaces, which for all kinds of reasons related to cleaning or anything else. You have to be careful when we're looking at flooring or carpet, for example, because this is a question that I recently was discussing with an airport where they wanted all of this low profile carpet flooring throughout the airport to do a much needed sound baffling, but making sure that it wasn't interfering or impeding with any rolling, in this case, wheel mobility devices. But if we were in a lab setting, it would be like any rollable machinery or power chairs or any of those kinds of things. So, um, some flooring and some ceiling and sound baffling treatments are examples. Even just looking or examining your lab environment, put the accessibility lens filter on and go back and say, how are we organizing the activity in this space? Is there a way from a layout point of view that makes sense to that we could change this environment so that we have, that we either distribute the noise or that we have an area that's able to kind of fulfill this purpose a little bit better. Because we might be really good at looking at our space through these are the regulated cleaning requirements, or we've organized it for a certain kind of operational efficiency. But maybe we haven't looked at it through that human performance lens and what kinds of insights we might get.
Thank you for that. Another question has come forward, and maybe reflecting, Matthew, on other groups that you've worked with. Maybe it's in the laboratory space. When we have provincial guidelines, maybe on the type of space that an industry should conform to, and then we have a more like national type group that does advocacy on behalf of that profession, what could the federal and the provincial levels do to work together to, like you say, kind of raise the floor on this accessibility performance?
That's a good question. So, I mean, from a vet practice point of view, and I'll try not to put everybody to sleep with the couple of minutes that we have left, is we do have an extensive like accessibility legislative infrastructure. We now have some federal law and accessibility. We have provincial law and accessibility, and then we might have design standards or other best practices that are being put forward by even by professional associations and different groups. Um, my single biggest suggestion for people who are trying to navigate their compliance requirements is actually to just put the compliance point of view slightly to the side and begin with what do we want people to experience here? How do we kind of look towards best practice? And then if we kind of set it up in that way, then we will meet and exceed the requirements of the minimal compliance view. So it's just looking a little bit further in terms of how we get started. And then if people have specific questions on how we can move past that at some point, like I'm always happy to answer those. That's a common problem even on the other side. On the legislation and policy side, we're dealing with jurisdictions and provinces wanting to bring new best practices in. There's new research, and that's great. But then what you risk happening is all of a sudden they'd be like, here's 40 sets of technical specifications, or every province and federally or different departments within, they're all using different data. And how do we kind of bring all of that together so that it's a kind of consistent experience across the country? So if you're here today and you're based in Nova Scotia, or you're based in Ontario, or you're based in BC, the kind of network of legislation that you're kind of working within from an accessibility point of view might be different. But in almost any case, that's why I say elevate, bring something like an RHFAC method into your work so that you can just really look at it, what it's actually like in terms of how people experience it, irrespective of the particular details in your jurisdiction.
That is super helpful. I'm making copious notes, and I think this is an opportunity to use the laws and the experience with the provincial veterinary registrars and the CVMA to bring the RHFAC method into the work. There may be a working group soon on that. We've got a number of other questions. I know we're at the top of the hour. If we're able to stay on a few extra minutes, that is wonderful. Something about sample design data for a new veterinary clinic. So thinking in terms of taking these experiences into account at the design stage.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's so the one, and I do need to leave here in about 5 minutes, as I know everybody else does on the call here. So we'll get to what we
Thanks,
can, and
Matthew.
then I'm always happy to reconnect. Is that there is a body of best practices that are able to kind of transcend many different typologies. So there are existing specs and resources that we can bring from other environments into a laboratory setting. We didn't talk too much today about bringing this kind of philosophy into design of new sites as it is to evaluating existing sites. But that's a very good point. It's our platform, we support both. So our whole aim is to help existing sites identify opportunities to improve and enhance, but we also offer and kind of support the inclusion of our HFAC in the design process as a way of benchmarking how we're making sure that design projects will meet the needs of accessibility, and our actual certification program has begun to be adopted as a requirement for construction within a few municipalities and jurisdictions across in Canada, and that's something we want to see grow. So something in terms of a vet world would be requiring or strongly recommending that in the construction of new sites or choosing where to build new sites that we're including accessibility procurement information, or that we are putting forward a way or a methodology of ensuring that how we design and build those sites are going to meet our needs, because that's the single best opportunity, right? To ensure that our spaces are going to be accessible and adaptable to everybody.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. Recognizing that we are beyond time and also giving space to those folks who do need to jump off, including Matthew. A reminder that I'll take questions and I'll report back, and I put the link into the chat as to where the CE certificate, presentation notes, and the answers to these questions, as long as Matthew is willing to do this. I'll report back there. I did put a link in the survey for a link in the chat for a very short survey, because your insights and experience on this webinar are very important to help CVMA shape what do we need to do going forward to help all of you in this space. And I'll thank Matthew as we get to the end of National Accessibility Week. So grateful to have you as a speaker, Matthew. And I think back to what you said, that there's, 2,000 workplaces and structures in Canada that have gone through the RHFAC. I've been to one of them. It's a smaller location, Cowbell Brewing in Blythe, Ontario. At this point in time, as far as I know, there aren't any veterinary practices in Canada, and we have nearly 4,700 approved veterinary practice entities in Canada. Wouldn't it be great to have one of your practices go through the process? Not to put a lot of extra work on anyone. As Matthew, you said, there are some very straightforward and entry point ways to start flexing the muscle. Yet, wouldn't it be fabulous if we could really help everyone go everywhere to fully participate in the things that they're doing, either at work or in supporting their own animals at veterinary clinic spaces and life in general. So with that, I'll wish all of you a great end to National Accessibility Week. Have a wonderful weekend. I hope you get outside to enjoy some nature. That is very good for our mental health. And I thank you for joining. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.